And he's going to talk to us about that today. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. So yeah, this is really special to be back here. Two of my friends actually from my time here came down as well, and we were so nostalgic walking around campus yesterday, and I think there's really good reason for that, which is, at least I mean in my career, and also this book had a lot of roots here. One, my interest in Europe, and also Christiana and John's support in terms of getting into graduate school and shaping my early thinking on European politics. So it's really, really great to be back here. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to talk today about, so as Melanie mentioned, the diffusion of norms governing LGBT rights. I think during the decade, or I guess a little more than a decade now that I spent thinking about these issues, I'd be surprised by lots of the changes we saw. For example, last year, Catholic Ireland would pass same-sex marriage by popular vote. Malta became a trailblazer on trans recognition. Things that, even during the time when I was working on this book and thinking about it, would be considered really, large surprises. So in many ways, part of my work on this book, or while I was working on it, came to investigate that recent history of transnational movements, momentum and focusing also on this international dimension to the way that norms, it's not really entirely a coincidence that we see certain types of policies spreading or rising in multiple domestic contexts around the same time. So I'm going to argue in the talk, and I know that you've read a little bit of my work, so I'm not going to talk about the whole book. I'll just talk a little about the pieces that I think you're familiar with, and then, but I'm going to make the case that the politics of visibility has engendered the interactions between movements and states that empower marginalized people, so particularly weak, quote-unquote weak groups in society, because it mobilizes those actors to demand change from their states, influences the spread of new legal standards, and weaves new ideas into the fabric of states and societies. So that's so I guess I should walk over to the So in Europe, more so than anywhere else, we've seen LGBT rights become part of this definition of what we consider human rights. It's emerged, LGBT rights have emerged at the heart of the global expansion of human rights, yet they remain really contested in many states. Many times they're seen to dismantle the very foundation upon which national identity is based by some segments of society, so there's often a lot of times resistance to these types of norms. That said, scholars have also noted that we should study clashes of social systems to understand how the world changes. So I think for political scientists, this is also a really useful case to look at when it comes to LGBT rights. Poland, some of these pictures, most of them are from my fieldwork in Poland. Poland was one of the cases I spent a lot of time in, and it became one of these kind of poster child cases for a case where diffusing the European norm on LGBT rights was quite difficult. There was a lot of resistance to it there. In the year 2000, there was a survey that showed only 1 in 10 Poles had claimed to know an LGBT or a gay person. About 10 years ago, there were still bills being put in front of Parliament to remove LGBT people from their teaching positions in schools. And around the time when I was in TAM, 2005 and 2006 was right after accession to the European Union. Public assembly by LGBT people was denied in multiple Polish cities, from Warsaw, Łódź, Poznan to Krakow. So this is one of the cases where we saw kind of this the spread of this norm was quite difficult. That said, despite what social movement scholars call a closed political opportunity structure at home, because there was not many allies for the movement, despite that, Polish activists were able to mobilize, and they did so by forming connections to activists in other countries, and bringing in also resources and attention from the outside to put pressure on the state from above. And that's a little bit kind of, I'm going to get, at the end of the talk, I'll get to the Polish case in depth. I just wanted to introduce it briefly to kind of signal that this is the kind of story we're talking about today. It's a story about how transnational activists can channel transnational support to affect domestic politics, and a story about how norms can become salient and people can come out under these broader conditions of visibility. So why do this study in Europe? So Europe is, despite the fact that, I was predestined to be interested in Europe after having done a master's program on it, it's also, in terms of theory and method, also pretty interesting for this case. It's the only region where we have an internationally binding law protecting LGBT people, or at least actually it's based on sexual orientation specifically, but that was first in Article 13 of the Amsterdam Treaty. There's also various court rulings and then also non-binding European Parliament resolutions that have led some scholars, like Kelly Coleman's really pioneering work, to note that we see the development of a norm protecting LGBT rights in Europe and in European institutions. So that's the idea that that LGBT rights become part of the values of being, quote unquote, being European, or being a member as a state, being a member of the European Union. Despite the fact that, that's something I agree with, there's a lot of evidence for that, but despite that we see a lot of variation on the ground in the degree to which states actually accept this norm or agree with it. So there's tremendous variation actually across EU member states, even in the region that is most friendly, to LGBT people. It's really different. Like in surveys in around the mid-2000s that asked, is homosexuality acceptable? The number of Dutch people that said it's never acceptable was at 7%, and in Hungary it was over 80%. So we see like really rapid, really strong variation across different contexts. Methodologically, Europe has also been interesting because of the Iron Curtain. So we had the sexual revolution, and we also had the HIV/AIDS crisis, which led to more activism on the Western side, which means that societies were discussing some of these norms earlier. And so when we think about diffusion from one context to another, that created also an interesting methodological setup where new member states were confronted with some of these norms in a different period. So that variation is what leads to this overarching question of the book, which is why the trajectory is different across states. And there's two ways to look at that, which what you read about was just the first component, which I'll talk about today, which is compliance. That's looking at change at the level of the state, so we can measure that by looking at the types of LGBT-friendly laws that states adopt. And then in terms of norm diffusion, we can also think of it in terms of internalization, which is change at the societal level, so the way people actually think and feel about LGBT people. So sometimes they don't always correlate entirely, and that's one of the puzzles of the book, that how these move. And so in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about internalization too, if it's interesting to you guys. So that's the focus for today. There are many explanations that help us gain traction on this question. That said, that much of the earlier work was focused on domestic explanations, which made sense because we didn't have that many cases that really had much to write home about in terms of LGBT rights laws, and also because and also because we saw first mover states like the Protestant Nordic states, or the Netherlands was a case that also made a lot of changes early on. And these first movers had distinctive characteristics that many scholars charted, and so we had explanations based on religious cultural context, on economic wealth and modernity, on the organizing capacity of movements, the level of democratization, or the pluralization of sexual practice. And these were all very important factors, these domestic factors, but they become muddled when we think about all of the new states that are adopting these types of norms. So the new adopters don't always look like the early adopters when we think of the variety of countries. Indeed, 20 European countries have some form of same-sex union now, and very few of them have the same type of domestic factors that explain these changes in a country like Sweden. So that's what I try to think about when we go beyond the early explanations, is to say that domestic variables are very important, but they can't be isolated from the broader international environment, which I think for all of you as Europeanists studying the European polity is probably a pretty obvious thing to say, that they're entangled. But sometimes in political science we separate out too clearly, like IR work from comparative work, and I think in this case they're really a mesh. So if we look to the IR explanations, there's a lot of helpful literature, but it doesn't go entirely all the way in explaining this. There's ideas of domestic resonance, which expect international norms to diffuse to where they fit the best with the domestic system. And that has led some people to say, well, then they're actually diffusing to places where we need them the least. But despite that criticism, we do see surprising misfits that do change. You know, Spain and Portugal, two Catholic countries, become leaders on LGBT rights, or equally secular Czech Republic and Latvia move very different on this issue. We also see weaker democracies that end up making greater strides than stronger democracies. So there's all kinds of interesting dynamics there. Modernization also doesn't correlate as strongly with the adoption of post-material values like accepting homosexuality. It's not as strong as we would expect. The other ideas don't really capture variation, which is one, the idea in international relations that human rights laws get adopted so easily because they're low cost. They're materially inexpensive to adopt because you don't have to do anything when you adopt them. But as we can see, when you see tanks being rolled up to LGBT Pride parades, states do actually find these costly in a non-material dimension in terms of an identity dimension. Then there's also ideas from the World Polity School, which I draw on a whole lot theoretically. I have great respect for the ideas that come from there, which would expect kind of an isomorphism around certain ideas. But it also doesn't account for the really strong variation that we see, which I think in part is because agency and deliberation is still a little bit under-theorized in those older works. And then finally, there's ideas from the post-Soviet syndrome, which would expect the kind of bankruptcy of civil society or inheritance from the past to path-dependently lock all new EU member states into kind of this position. But that also doesn't hold because we see many new EU member states that have actually become leaders on these issues versus others that haven't. So while the region is, you know, quote unquote behind in some aspects, it's not uniform across those cases. And this is the variation that I'm talking about in terms of the laws. This is an index. There's a lot going on here, and I'm sorry for that, but it's just 3 different time points, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And this is an index of pro-LGBT laws, various categories from like whether LGBT people can adopt children, to what kind of partnership they can have, to whether there's anti-discrimination measures in place, and the relationships are decriminalized and equal in terms of sexual relationships. So we see a lot of variation, and if you look just at the yellow bar in 2010, you can see a little bit how different this is across context, and there's a little bit of a rough divide here if we think of like the new adopter. These are the new EU member states, and we see that they fall a little bit on this end of the spectrum. And those are the states that I want to talk about particularly today in the talk to explain some of that variation. And I'll end with a little bit of an overview of Poland. Poland is one of the few case studies in the book, but it's one that I found interesting for the talk today. And I'll also talk about Germany a little bit because activists in Germany were involved with Poland in supporting the Polish movement. So it's kind of, in terms of theory, like norm entrepreneur and target state dynamic that they have between each other. So, so I argue that differing degrees of visibility, just get this up here, differing degrees of visibility have produced different outcomes for socio-political change across these states. And this concept, norm visibility, is quite simply defined as the relative ability of publics and governments to see and interact with the ideas and images that define standards of appropriate behavior. So I agree that a norm might exist, but I think its felt intensity might vary in different contexts based on a set of channels that connect states to their international community. And I'll talk about these in turn in the next slides, but there's international channels like social channels, which could be, for example, the circulation of media or television that bring new ideas and images into the domestic context, or political channels, which could be through mechanisms of sanction by states entering into international organizations like the EU, or signing multilateral treaties, etc. And then there's an important broker channel, which are activists. These are activists that are embedded, they're local activists, but they're embedded in transnational advocacy networks. So they become the link between the activist community in one country and the broader umbrella groups and other groups that can support, that have a similar goal. Just very briefly, social channels are about openness to ideas, information, and images, and the quantitative measures, they're measured by the circulation or the differences in the degree to which states have like numbers of internet users, cable television subscribers, etc. This comes from data that has been already collected by Swiss Economic Institute. And then the political channels are measured in number of embassies, IOs to which a country is a member, and treaties signed between 2 or more states. And these channels have this kind of a dynamic. This is a cartoon from a German paper which it says gay marriage, and it shows an Irish couple passing a bouquet to Angela Merkel, who's trying to avoid catching it, but because she has enough other stuff to worry about, I guess, at the time. But this shows this kind of pattern that we see, immediately activists in Germany and also Italy and Greece said, well, I can't believe Catholic Ireland got gay marriage before us, what are we going to do? And it creates a discourse in other countries. Italy and Greece both moved with a civil union partnership within about 7 or 8 months after the Irish case. Slovenia passed marriage a few weeks later. So there are international dynamics to these things, even if it's not the only explanation, of course, but I try to capture a little bit of that. Norm brokers are these activists, which I find very important because the LGBT issue and these identities themselves, even though they have universal elements, they're still really specific to different contexts. That means that they are not embraced by all societies in the same way. So the way they are framed and packaged for a specific audience is really important if you want to diminish the amount of backlash that it receives. So a Polish activist might use Catholic frames to present LGBT rights, which might make less sense to an activist, in New York or something, but it depends. That really helps in terms of engaging the audiences that are there. If they're diffusing it on their own, we see resistance and backlash kind of happen to a much higher degree, and that's why I find these actors very important, and they're measured as local groups who are embedded in transnational advocacy networks. So they have both the localness to understand the context where they are in, plus they have the transnational dimension to which they're connected to resources and support from the outside that they can also channel in some of the resources around us. So that's the type of group. And again, we'll talk about all of these with a concrete example of Poland at the end of the talk, but those are the main concepts that we're talking about here. Here you see, this is IGA, for example, the International Gay Association, which is now called the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans, and Intersex Association. It was founded in 1978. There's a really long history of transnational activism around gay politics, going all the way back to Berlin in the 1800s, that we're doing surveys in multiple countries. So this is not new that sexual minorities and also other minorities like gender minorities have seen part of their experience as shared across borders, that mobilization and power in numbers across borders have been seen as effective. ILGA Europe today is a branch of the larger ILGA international organization, even though the Europeans have a much larger office than the entire international group and much more funding, because the EU funds them to lobby them, actually, which is a really interesting dynamic. So the main hypotheses, if this is correct, what we would expect to see is that as political and social channels to Europe increase, states should be more likely to adopt LGBT legislation, and as domestic LGBT organizations become embedded in transnational activist networks, that's this idea of norm brokers, that states should then also be more likely to adopt LGBT legislation. And we look at that in all EU member states as a whole, but then also in 2 groups, which I think you saw in the article that you read, but then also in case studies of the actual brokered transnational mobilization between Brussels and Poland, and also between Berlin and Poland. And then I look at 2, or I think you read an article, a second article maybe as well, between Poland and Slovenia, which are 2 states, 2 new states that move very differently on the issue, and it kind of tries to isolate a little bit why those 2 states look different in relation to the argument. I spent a lot of time in the field, and I won't talk about this very long, but I did interviews with LGBT activists, but also with their opponents, mainly with LGBT activists because that was much easier to get access. But then I also spent a lot of time doing participant observation at their meetings and events, and coding certain data to add to some existing data that we had that was available to create some data sets to look at attitudes and laws on this issue. The legislation data set is the one that we're using today, and that's 40 years from 1970, which is right around the time of gay liberation, to 2010. And that's because I finished my dissertation field work in 2012, so it's being updated right now, actually. But the groups they look at the groups as a whole and then old and new EU member states. And then in this analysis that I'll show you, the dependent variable, which is LGBT rights, is an ordinal variable, which means there's different categories. And the idea is that you can have a low category of rights or a high category. So if you're a country that has partnership, anti-discrimination, et cetera, you might have like a score of 5. But if you have just one level, you might have a score of 1. All right. And then the independent variables, the predictors, are the core channels that I just talked about, along with a series of domestic variables and then some other controls. And I won't show you the whole analyses here, but just a snippet of them. Some basic logit analyses which explain they try to predict the likelihood of when states will get to higher levels of pro-LGBT law. And what we see here is that so these are the new EU member states, that these channels, when states become more connected via these channels, you see a really strong effect of reaching, and significant effect of reaching higher level of laws in those contexts. This chart explains the predicted probability of those laws being passed when norm brokers exist. So when those activist groups are present in the domestic context. And this is like no adoption, so no laws being passed. And this is high adoption, that many laws will be passed. And so you can see that when they exist, the probability of no adoption happening is lower, as we might expect. And when they exist, the probability of medium or high adoption is higher. This is a little bit of a peculiar finding, which is the low adoption finding, but it makes sense because decriminalization of sex, for example, happened in many contexts that had nothing to do with the LGBT movement. It was part of the broader liberalization around sexual relations, which happened in part in the French Revolution, but also some countries, Poland decriminalized same-sex relationships in 1931. So many of the studies that have looked at movement activity have looked only at decriminalization of sex, and the problem with that is that then we have this finding that movements don't matter because they see that. But that's because LGBT activists are concerned with other issues than just decriminalization, and many of them, when they have started in movements, have had other things to worry about. The older movements in the 1800s did worry about sodomy legislation in many cases. That's what started the German movement in the 1800s. But still, when we look at cases today, it would make less sense to focus just on that one level. So, oops. This just glitched a little bit. Maybe it'll come up, I don't know. Not sure, Lily, if something's going on with the slides. It skipped forward like
It's wonky.
I pushed it too much. But anyway, so I showed you some overall trends. I wanted to move into the case of Poland real quick now, which to describe some of the mechanisms behind these correlations. So there's a slide before that. Sure. Sure. I can just keep talking. Yeah. So in the year 2005, so that was like shortly after I came to landed in Berlin. I landed in Berlin at the end of 2004. Yeah, so it's this slide here that I need. Yeah, that's fine. So in the year 2005, the then mayor of Warsaw, Lech Kaczynski, was planning to again ban the LGBT Pride in Warsaw. So that was he would later be president of Poland that passed away in that fatal plane crash. But he was very against the idea of LGBT people marching in the streets, and so when he again was going to ban it in 2005, what happened was that a lot of Polish activists decided to organize it anyways, even though it was illegal. But they organized it in part by planning it in other cities, including Berlin, and bringing in activists from other contexts. And one of the main organizer, I have a quote from him here, he said, through contacts with European elites, it was much easier for me to organize it from Germany than from Poland, where the environment was very hostile at the time. In retrospect, these international political pressures were much more important than if I would have done this in Poland alone. So how did these, oh, it went ahead again.
Press escape.
Escape? We don't, yeah, we'll just leave it like this, that's fine.
Okay.
So here you can see kind of this dynamic. This is from Berlin, actually, from the Christopher Street Day Parade, which is also international because Christopher Street is where the Stonewall Inn sits in New York. So there's all these transnational dynamics. But and the first LGBT organization in the U.S. was a protege of Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a Berlin activist. But here we see these dynamics, and this is in 2009, where you see the German and Polish flag enshrined by the European Union stars. And you'll also recognize the Solidarity logo, which is from the Polish Solidarity movement. So that's kind of taking it, but it's saying gay solidarity in Polish, but at a German pride. And so these, yeah, let's go to the next one. So why do these ties matter? You know, what do they do? So they bring in different kinds of resources. One, in 2005, it was estimated that around 5,000 of the marchers in Warsaw were foreign nationals. Many of them were German just because of the proximity to Germany. And they also had the support of elites. I mean, that's Claudia Holt, the chairwoman of the Green Party at the time, and before that she was a European MEP. And she's standing behind a Council of Europe poster that says the foundations of the Council of Europe are human rights, and you can see the way the rainbow flag is juxtaposed with the European flag. By 2006, 32 parliamentarians representing 16 different national governments marched in the Warsaw Pride Parade. Can we move on?
Yeah.
Oh, I can. Awesome. All right. So visibility is also generated through material resources through these kinds of ties. So LGBT organizations or groups are really dependent, at least in part, on their budget from international sources. So you can see the new EU member states, these are the 2004 and 2007 waves that are here. 83% depend at least in part, for part of their budget from international sources, and 56% depend on the majority of their budget from international sources. In many cases, it's the full budget of these groups that get funding from outside the context. They also bring in know-how and best practice for some groups that have worked on some of these issues in other contexts first. That said, not all experiences travel, and that's a really important thing to connect back to this idea of norm brokers, that they are local as well. Because when you have, for example, when you have Germans marching in Warsaw, which is never, that's never a really resonant or salient image to ever have Germans doing anything in the domestic sphere in Poland, based on their history with each other. When you have that kind of dynamic, that can really give fodder to the right, who will then say that these are outside Western values that are imposing in the domestic sphere here. So activists or norm brokers, they reframe this by saying, instead of Germans marching for LGBT rights, they would become Europeans marching for democratic values and human rights responsibilities associated with the EU. That's the way they defined it. Actually, Claudia Holt, you defined her involvement that way, saying this has nothing to do with the German-Polish relationship, it has everything to do with European responsibilities and human rights. So activists wear t-shirts with the European Union stars that says Europa equals Tolerantia. They wave EU flags, and it becomes a European issue. At least at that time, that was the frame that worked because it was right after EU accession. So these, when we talk about outcomes, I want to be cautious not, to not, oops. All right, we're having that problem again.
Just
Escape, yeah, press escape.
Oh,
Sorry. Okay, that's good. So Poland is not a success story when it comes to LGBT rights. And when we think of the new government that was elected last year, there's a lot more problems. That said, there were small advances made because of this kind of activism. There were several votes on partnership, which came very close to passing. They actually passed the trans recognition bill, which the new president then vetoed. Unfortunately, the parliament had passed it. We saw new political parties emerging in the scene, like Ruch Palikota, which that's what it was called at the time, Palikot's movement. In 2011, they got over 10% of the vote. So in a parliamentary system, that's pretty impressive for a brand new political party. This was at the election party I was at after the event, and that's Anna Grodzka, who's the first trans woman to be elected into parliament in Poland. At the time, she was actually the only trans woman in any federal government in the world. There had been two before her, but they weren't in office anymore. And that election also brought Robert Biedron, which was the first openly gay parliamentarian into into the parliament in that election. So that was in 2011. We've also seen visibility around the issue has increased tremendously, in part also because international film crews are taping Claudia Wolf marching there, and other people. The international attention really came on Poland quite a bit because of this type of activism. And then also it brought state protection. It engaged state authorities and brought protection to activists. That's done in part because when these marches are illegal, that means they don't have police protection. And many of them have to be canceled in Central Eastern Europe because there's a lot of violence that can happen. I mean, really aggressive scenes from many of the accounts and also stuff that I saw when I was doing my field work there, that these are not safe to have in all contexts. And when they're illegal, they're not protected, and then oftentimes they just get canceled. So by activists bringing these elites in to march with them, that changes the dynamic as well, because it provides a kind of a human shield effect. So when the German embassy is bringing Claudia Wolf to the front of the march, then the police have to show up, even if the parade is illegal. So you have this important visibility effect happening that would otherwise not happen. And state authorities are also engaged when you see social democrats, for example, marching there, or when they meet with them in the European Parliament. Even though the left was cautious about this issue, because the left in Poland had many rural and agrarian voters that didn't score highly on positive attitudes towards LGBT people, but they had to talk about the issue eventually because of their colleagues that were present. And one activist put it this way, he said, outside influence is motivational. These politicians read the outside stances of their parties, and whether or not they are convinced, they know what it means to be a social democrat in Europe, which now includes being open to LGBTs. Polish political parties now have to know about the topic, not to embarrass themselves at international congresses. So it puts the impetus sometimes also even before the state is ready there. So okay, yes, I'll go to the next one. How am I doing on time? Should I can wrap up sooner or go 10 more minutes. It depends.
It's fine to go 10 more minutes.
It's fine. Okay. All right. So. So what we talked about now, it makes a strong case for the effect that transnational movements have on the ability of norms to become visible and salient in the domestic discourse, and that transnational politics really affects rights and attitudes towards these issues. But the second half of the book, which I think is also an important aspect to mention, is that resistance and backlash are quite common when visibility rises as well. And there it develops an argument around trying to understand what kind of cases respond with resistance to these international norms being diffused. And it seems to me that nationalism, when religion is embedded in the national identity, those are the cases where we see a lot more problems. So, for example, in Poland, where the church fell on the side of Franco in Spain, where the church fell on the side of Franco during democratic transition, the church was really, it fell on, quote unquote, the wrong side, I guess. The church was really delegitimized, and it could not be a moral authority when Spain was making all these moves towards LGBT people. In Poland, that had a different dynamic there, because the church was resisting outside forces throughout much of the last century. If we think of the German invasions, or then we think of the influence of the Soviet Union in Poland and the role that the church played in democratization. The church was seen as the liberalizing force on the side of the people. And that when the church decided to have an issue with the outside influence of LGBT rights, it made it much more difficult for activists in Poland, in part because they were faced with the resistance that came from that. So I think when we think of resistance on the streets, the link between religion and national identity is an important factor around this issue, at least when that happens. That said, sometimes resistance also benefits the movement because it further makes it visible, so everyone has to talk about it for the first time. There's a quote from a Hungarian activist, actually, where she said, "The right wing has become very strong in the past 4 years, but I think there was a favorable shift in the public response. In 2008, when Gay Pride happened, it was very violent, and that was a bit too much for a lot of people. Even for people who thought that Gay Pride shouldn't have happened in the first place. It was so violent, so aggressive, there were between 1,000 and 2,000 marchers and 5,000 riot police. It was horrible, but that horror made the whole thing more visible. By whole thing, I mean both the extremist violence and gay people. And this time it was not the gay people who were seen as violating public morals, but the extremists. So this can be indirect dynamic for visibility in some cases as well. Well, maybe go to this cartoon real quick. So this is a cartoon that that was kind of interesting. This was by the Polish opposition to gay rights, and they have here, they're being a little sarcastic because it says, "These are the fascists?" ? And these are the Poles. And what you see here is you see, like, you know, quote unquote normal looking Poles with Polish flags, but here you see all of, you know, people that are considered degenerates by the Polish opposition holding the EU flag, which makes, and then a flag that says gay is okay. Ironically, they also have a hammer and sickle flag, which is really interesting because, I mean, the Soviet Union was not pro-gay rights whatsoever, but they are considered antithetical to Polish national identity. So it makes sense that all of this is lumped together as kind of a threat to Polish national identity. You know, even though it doesn't make any sense based on any type of fact, you know, but that's the way it was framed in the discourse. Could you skip ahead? To the thank yous slide, actually, slide that one. Slide. So I'll wrap up on this slide, and I think while this makes a strong case, or I hope it makes a strong case for the effect that transnational movements can have on the ability of norms to become salient and visible in the domestic discourse, I want to end with like a slight note of caution in terms of how to interpret this, which I also do in the book. I think that when we observe, you know, especially from the US, when we're looking at the changes we've seen here and also the really positive changes in many countries around the world, it can lead us to be very optimistic about LGBT rights. You know, we can think about quotes like from Victor Hugo, who said in the 19th century that nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, or was Cesar Chavez right when he was referencing civil rights when he said, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride, and you cannot oppress people who are not afraid anymore. You know, those ring true in many ways for many of us probably observing this. That said, we have to keep in mind that this is not a unidirectional process. There's a lot of polarization in the world right now around these issues on backlash to gender ideology and backlash towards rights of LGBT people. It has become actually a core part of Russian foreign policy to oppose many of these rights.